Lisa, do you see Norman? He's waving at you.
Oh, I will open up the thing.
Yes.
Norman,
Hi, Lisa.
how are you? It's nice to see some familiar faces and names, if not your face.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right. So I will go ahead and introduce you. We're so excited to have you. So everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Lucero to Boston University, even if remotely. All right. So Dr. Lisa Lucero is a professor in the Anthropology department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Lisa Lucero is also the former president of the Archaeology Division of the American Anthropological Association and has been elected as a fellow by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And this is an esteemed position that is held for a lifetime and awarded across scientific disciplines on the basis of excellence, both in terms of one's research and their ability to communicate their research to the general public. So this is huge. And then Dr. Lucero has been conducting archaeological projects in Belize for 30 years, where her research interests have focused on the emergence and demise of political power, ritual, water management, the impact of climate change on society, and the classic Maya more broadly. And her scholarship has been widely published, including her book, Water, Ritual, The Rise and Fall of Classic Maya Rulers, as well as published numerous edited volumes and within journals such as the Journal of Archaeological Research, Antiquity, Cambridge Archaeological Journal, Journal of Social Archaeology, Latin American Antiquity, and Current Anthropology, among others. And more recently, Dr. Lucero has been excavating ceremonial architecture near cenotes that served as part of a pilgrimage landscape where she incorporates insights from the Maya on tropical sustainability issues and applies them to her work with UNESCO Mexico, as well as with colleagues in Southeast Asia. So everybody join me in thanking Dr. Lucero for joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, but also everybody, if you guys have questions throughout, feel free to add them into chat and we'll sort of reserve time for questions and answers at the end of the talk. All right, thank you so much, Lisa. We're so excited.
All right, well, thank you for inviting me to give a talk for the Archaeology Program lecture series here. I'm really excited. And David Carballo, I see you're here. I thank you for the extra plug and competing with the band Lucero. So I'm really hoping that I think they might have a larger audience, but that's okay. Let me get this. Oops. Okay, so I mean, many of you are familiar with the Maya. So what I'm going to do is just give a brief background and then get into the inclusive worldview and how it's relevant to our particular, to futures, to sustainable practices and this kind of thing. So first of all, I focus on the southern Maya lowlands here that I'm circling and in the interior and up to the coast. And I work in central Belize at this area here, and here's Carablanca. And this information that I'm sharing with you now is actually really relevant to understand how it impacts the worldview as well as the water management systems that I briefly discussed, because it's a limestone bedrock. And because of that, there's ironically, interestingly, limited surface water because of the karstic landscape, because calcium carbonate, limestone is very porous. So a lot of the rain percolates through. And so there's a lot of groundwater. The question is whether or not it's accessible. They also have seasonal wetlands, which of course, they're mostly swampy areas, especially in the rainy season. There are hundreds of centers and kings with varied scales of political economy and power. There wasn't, an overarching king like you find in other cultures, other societies. And the critical thing about being in the semi-tropical culture society is the same thing that it's found in other tropical societies. The issue of water, too much, not enough, the seasonality where, part of the time it's, just almost flooded, and the rest of the time it's like a green desert. The tropical storms, the hurricanes, and so on. Also water quality issues, for daily drinking needs, cooking, ceramic manufacture, plaster manufacture, just everything. And this has a major impact on their society, which is a hierarchical society during the late classic period, especially. But everything was rainfall dependent. Because of the entrenched river systems in most areas, most rivers are entrenched. It's not conducive to irrigation systems. So this promoted the reliance on rainfall dependency. And there weren't metals, there weren't wheeled carts, and there weren't beasts of burden to pull the wheeled carts. And what we find in the Maya area are more labor intensive projects. I mean, they're technologically sophisticated. The issue is, of course, what you do with that technology and what kind of projects you focus on, technological ones or labor intensive ones, or a bit of both. And that's relevant for some of the things I want to talk about. Now, this is a map of different soil types in my research area, and the numbers are different sites. Like this is the medium-sized center of Yalbak, for example. Here's some of the Cara Blanca pools. And the soil diversity is mirrored in all other resources. So you have different flora and different fauna and the different relationships. So there's high biodiversity, but it's dispersed. And then the class 1 soils are alluvium, which again are rare because of the entrenched rivers. So the richest, the most fertile soils for hand cultivation are these class 2 soils. Okay, so you can see my research area has, relatively small percentage, and there's a direct correlation with settlement size and density and the location of these soils. But again, it has to do with diversity and the dispersed population and the implication of that. And so you have the centrifugal forces, especially during the rainy season, because the fertile soils are dispersed, you have dispersed farmsteads, and because everything is localized, you have various scales of extensive and intensive agriculture. Some areas have terraces, like this is outside of Caracol. I mean, it's surrounded by terraces, which is very unique to Caracol, having so many terraces, and then aguadas and causeways or sakbeob. And so you have the varying scales of these water and agricultural systems. And this is called a low density urban system, which again is found in tropical areas. And the centripetal forces are especially take place during the dry season, because during the rainy season, that's the agricultural intensive period, and that's during the rain, and there's plenty of water for daily needs. But during the dry season, it's usually about 5 months, 3 months of which it doesn't rain at all. So leaders, to attract subjects, to attract tribute payers, they built these increasingly massive and large interlocked reservoir systems that provided water during the dry season. And this is also the time there are ceremonies and ball games, markets, pomp and circumstance, and so on. So I argue that there was some degree of seasonal power, and that's something I'm working on for a future article, hopefully in the next year or so, once I get some other obligations out of the way. But so you have these two forces working together, and it's more seasonal. And so Maya centers, people, especially like Vern Scarborough and others, refer to them as water mountains because of the role reservoirs and the dams and the walkways and the canals and play a role in urban planning. So this walkway here, for example, also serves as a dam, and this is a place elsewhere. So as cities grew, their planning became intersected with the reservoir systems. So the urban layout increasingly became path dependent, and so was their power. I argue that the royals put all of their eggs in one basket and relied on the reservoirs to attract tributes, their labor, their goods and services, which is great as long as nothing changes in the system. And another thing they had to deal with, which they did quite well, I mean, Maya kings and reservoirs were around for nearly 1,000 years. You have the dry season, and you have the issue of standing water that can become very stagnant. Issues of humidity, waterborne diseases, land clearing worsens the above, which you get increasing evidence for during the late classic, when you have the highest population numbers, highest settlement density, and so on. Issues of human waste. We have yet to find ancient Maya toilets, for example. And so how did they keep it clean? They were around for a long time. Well, they applied their traditional ecological knowledge. I mean, they and their ancestors have been living there for thousands of years. They knew how things work. They knew how, to breed different plants and different animals. They knew how the biological system worked. So they applied this knowledge to add to the reservoirs, not only fish, but surface and subsurface plants. And they created what civil engineers called constructed wetland biospheres. I mean, you find them naturally, but they created their own. So reservoirs, more specifically, more accurately, are called constructed wetland biospheres. In household, you can still filter with sand and neutralizing using potash, and there's other processes. And Vern Scarborough and his team have excavated some of the reservoirs at Tikal and have found large layers of sand that were used to filter the water. As the rain fell, it filtered the water. So it's a very sophisticated system. I mean, and again, it's all knowledge based on having lived there for thousands of years. And the cool thing is that the indicator of clean water is the presence of Nymphaea ampla, which is a water lily. You see them here. Now, the thing is about water lilies is that they're actually very sensitive aquatic plants. They can only survive, they can only thrive in areas in water bodies with clean water. So you can't have too much algae, not too much calcium. You can't have too much water movement. It has to be still clean water. So when they're present, even we could drink the water. And as you know, water lilies also symbolize Maya power, Maya rulership, Maya royalty. And, you see the water lilies in headdresses, and you see a lot of fish and water iconography to show the association of kings with water management as water managers. So kings were basically water managers, and they did it quite well. But something happened that set in motion events that resulted in people leaving the kings, leaving the centers. And this is a shot from the web of an aerial view of Tikal. And you can see that a lot of the architecture in these centers are temples, open plazas, palaces, ball courts, and this kind of thing, areas for markets. And people lived on the outskirts or in the hinterlands in non-center areas. So increasing evidence shows that there were not only several droughts, but multiple droughts lasting anywhere from 3 to 18 years during the terminal classic, with peaks, several peaks, and increasingly more stalagmite data from caves is increasingly showing this 100-year period of climate instability that set in motions that ultimately resulted in the Maya abandoning centers and their kings. They voted with their feet. There's not massive evidence for mass, kill off or anything. If anything, kings just became what their ancestors had been, elite landowners. And the changing rainfall patterns would have exacerbated existing problems. In some areas did experience deforestation. Some did experience erosion or overuse of resources, but there are hundreds of Maya cities or centers, and each have their own history. And also the reservoir levels were dropping. Crops were failing in the interior areas with these large powerhouses, but with few lakes or few rivers, and those were drying up as well. And the number of droughts also explains why it took about 100 years for all the centers to be basically abandoned in the southern Maya lowlands. The northern lowlands is another story that I don't have time to talk about, but I do want to make the point that too many people conflate the histories of the northern lowlands and the southern lowlands, and they have very distinct histories. So I always say kings disappeared and people persevered, based on the fact that over 7 million Maya live today, which speaks to their sustainable way of life. As farmers for over 4,000 years. They've been farming in this area for 4,000 years without the massive deforestation we are seeing at present, resulting from non-Maya farming techniques. And this is a photo of my foreman, Cleofo Chok, and his family, and I have permission to use this photo. So I argue that they're able to do this because of an inclusive worldview that guided their daily existence and engagement with the non-human world. And I argue that kings, especially at the end of the late classics, started to divert from this inclusive worldview and became more path dependent, became more interested in rebuilding programs rather than addressing the problems that they were starting to face. I know that sounds familiar, but okay, so an inclusive worldview, and if you're interested, I can email you the article upon which this is based, situates objects, humans, animals, land, water, everything in an analogistic, animated manner on the same plane, if you will, not necessarily equal, but on the same plane, where each plays a role in maintaining their place in the world and the world itself. So everyone is interconnected, everyone has a role, and this role is maintained through relations. Expressed through rituals and ceremonies and engagement. And this is quite the opposite of our Western Cartesian dichotomous and linear worldview, you know, that has led up to the era we live in now, the anthropocentric, which attempts to keep nature out or control it. So the Maya, I argue, were one with world rather than with nature. And again, this acknowledgement is expressed through ceremonies and other types of interaction and collaboration. And so the Maya inclusive worldview is evidenced by various things. For example, there are no terms for nature, you know, so you don't have those dichotomous divisions, you know, nature, culture, supernatural, natural, and so on. Nor do they have a term for religion, because they didn't just go to church on Saturday or Sunday or whatever. It was just part of their daily existence. So there's some terms, Okolku, to enter God, or Utz Xanbal, a sacred righteous way of life, and Tzotzil, and this kind of thing, and other. And these are using English words to translate. Just keep in mind that we don't necessarily have the vocabulary to translate some of their concepts, but also Mayan languages are ergative. So they focus on a plurality of subjects. So there's a de-emphasis on me, myself, and I, and it focuses on we, us, and ours. And we includes clouds, plants, rivers, mountains, and the like, you know, more kinship kind of relations versus this, you know, divorcing from nature. And also ties into their circular way of thinking, which I think of as a moving spiral, not necessarily in a progressive sense, but just in a continuous sense, where death begets life through renewal. So you know, so everything is involved in this, you know, this renewal, you know, this, and we see this in the archaeological record and ancestor, you know, burials and termination rites and animation rites. And, you know, we see stratigraphy, but that stratigraphy represents this cyclical renewal of a house, for example. So everything is animated and has a soul, and it's the interaction, they interact with other souls. And everything is connected. And these souls are also recycled. So Keshol is the Mayan term for newborn, which is also replacement, you know, because it's the souls are being recycled in terms of the cyclical. So there's all these overlapping and nesting concepts of the cyclical way of life. And how this is expressed in their daily engagement with the non-human world is, rather than use the term forest management, which is something we'll have to use if we want to translate this into policy or to future management plans, is forest management. But I prefer, in terms of talking how the Maya did it, as forest collaboration. And several scholars have argued that the forest we see today is actually a descendant forest representing ancient Maya collaboration. So Colleen Lindsay, a former graduate student, and Cleofo, and her co-advisor was a plant botanist, set up these 40-meter diameter plots between the medium center of Yobak and Cara Blanca, and collected over 300 different species. And Cleofo was able to identify 95% of them in either English, either Mopan or Quechua Maya, or Spanish, you know, it just depended. And the 5% he did not identify, they had no use. So either the Maya were able to make use of every 95% of the plants and trees in the forest, or they actually called and promoted some flora over others. And the same goes for animals and birds and, you know, everything, reptiles, you name it. Okay, so So just keep that in mind, 95%. It's just sort of amazing. And this is his, Colleen got permission to also map his house lot in the Valley of Peace Village. And so the home garden and their fields, their milpas also reflect or mimic the diversity seen in the forest in terms of diversity. So monocropping is, you know, a relatively recent phenomenon. And so the numbers you see here, you see repeats, but they represent foods, medicine, household items, you know, for brooms, and ornamental, you know, flowers, poison to kill fish, construction materials, and so on. And this old stump actually is used to churn butter. So everything has a purpose, everything has a use, and nothing is wasted. Yet at the same time, you know, with all of this greenery, you know, they promote CO2 absorption and oxygen production and all this kind of thing. So, you know, if you think about applying whatever I'm saying to future planning, this is something to keep in mind. And also they still, the Maya, of course, in the past hunted, as do traditional Maya today, or Maya today. And so other than the tapir and the fer-de-lance snake, those are from the web, but everything else is from my project. And they don't necessarily eat snakes, but they're part of our daily existence since they are everywhere. And then the monkeys, ocellated turkeys, and fish and deer. And this is the national bird flower of Belize, the black orchid, but just the life. Now, the cool thing is one of my current PhD students, Rachel Gill, is doing a faunal analysis of 20 years worth of faunal collections from Yaba, Carablanca, and households in between to look at changes over time to see if the faunal record changes dramatically. Because when you have the presence of certain predominant or dominant species, that represents, so when you find the species of, let's say, a certain kind of deer, they rely on this certain kind of food, and this food also supplies other kinds of fauna. So when you see the presence of deer, it indicates a healthy forest. When you see the presence of different kinds of species, it indicates forest health and biodiversity. So we have collections from 300 BCE up through 1500 CE. So if we can look at, for her dissertation, she will be looking at forest health and biodiversity through the faunal record. And I'm really excited about this project. So that one way is through forest collaboration, you know, culling, promoting certain plants. Another way is through, of course, communicating with the gods and ancestors through portals. All openings in the earth are portals to the underworld or the other world, and to communicate with ancestors and gods. And also they're considered the origin of clouds and rain. Okay. And this is Aktun Tunichio Muknal in Belize, which has you know, a lot of common elements you find in caves, which are, of course, offerings in water, you know, water or food or whatever. And these are not sacrifices. That's another story. If you're interested, you can email me. I'm arguing they're ancient Maya witches. And that's another story. So, but what I'm focusing on is a type of engagement with watery portals, particularly cenotes, which are basically collapsed caves, you know, the porous limestone and all that. And then they're fed by groundwater. So groundwater, you know, emerges from below. And so it's a steep sided sinkhole fed by groundwater. It's pure water. It comes from the earth, from the gods, and it also connects to the sea. So there's all these, you know, connotations regarding that. There's over 7,000 cenotes in the northern lowlands. That's because it's much lower elevation, so the groundwater is closer to the surface. In the southern lowlands, sorry if you hear all the sirens. I live downtown Champaign, and my window unit, my air conditioning window unit is louder, so sorry about that. Sorry. Anyway, but in the southern lowlands, the elevation is much higher, so the water tables are much lower. So there are fewer cenotes in the southern lowlands. But the well-known ones in the north are Chichen Itza, and in Guatemala, Lake Amatlan, and so on. But I want to focus on Carablanca in central Belize. Now this is a soil map, and these are the rich soils, the class 2 soils that are excellently suited for hand cultivation and are very fertile. And these numbers here are sorry, are the pool numbers. I know they're not exciting. We don't have exciting Mayan names for them or anything, but for now there are 25 and there's 20 on here. But what I want to show you, these blue dots, this is part of Andrew Kinkella's dissertation. He's currently a professor at Moore Park. So here are lakes. They're fed by surface water, by rainfall and streams. The center ones are cenotes, and you can see there are fewer dots. The difference is that these are small centers, individual farmsteads, plazuelo groups, you know, from solitary mounds to large elite structures and so on. And they cluster near the lakes. But near cenotes, the blue dots actually represent architectural, ceremonial architecture, specialized. So near cenotes, ceremonial structures. Near lakes, farmsteads. Okay, so the pools are either lakes or cenotes, but I'm going to focus on cenotes. This is pool 20. This is 40 meters deep and about 100 meters diameter. Now, I argue that Cara Blanca is a pilgrimage destination, which I've written about before. But when I started to think about what does that mean in terms of sustainability, if you think about it, we don't find evidence for houses nearby or cities. Okay. And because of that, because it was a pilgrimage destination, and the same thing with sacred sites all over the world, there's a minimal footprint. So it's a type of forest management or collaboration because things are left alone. You know, flora and fauna can flourish. It's a type of conservation. You know, so you have these large areas throughout the Maya area that are left untouched, and throughout the world, ethnographically, there are cases of no man's land. Kind of thing. And that's the same thing for whatever reason, for warfare, for whatever reason there is, it is a type of conservation. Okay, and I want to focus particularly on pool 1. So this is a Google map. A lot's changed since then. And I'll explain at the end. So this is Whiteface, Cara Blanca. It was called that because it's soft limestone. So you have a lot of white cliffs, if you will, not as white as the white cliffs of Dover, but you can still see a lot of white. And thanks to funding from National Geographic and NSF, I've been able to explore them with a lot of different kind of divers, cave exploration divers and dendroclimatologists and paleontologists and so on. But I want to focus on pool 1. Now I know it looks like just a dot, but this is actually 100 meters across by 70 meters, and it is quite deep. It is over 200 feet deep. There's an underwater portal, an underwater cave. There are megafauna fossils, and we were looking for offerings, but it's so deep and there's so many trees because it's at the base of a cliff. Trees have been falling in for thousands of years. I know that because I had a piece of wood dated to 9,000 years ago. So there's a whole history in this pool waiting to be explored. That's another story. Okay, so here's just a picture of the portal, the underworld portal, the underwater portal. You can see the entrance, it's really dark here. And here's two of the divers, Marty O'Farrell and Chip Peterson. And I mean, it's pretty massive. And it wasn't the goal to explore the cave that season. So they went in 70 meters, but came back out. So that's something we need to explore. But the top of it is about 100 feet below the surface, or about, 25 meters or so. And the Maya probably knew about it because, deep sea pearl divers can dive up to 160 feet. So 100 feet would be possible. So they probably knew about it. And I got to, give a shout out to the megafauna fossils. They're just sticking out of the wall here. Here's Marty O'Farrell filming it. I have some great film, and there's articles. If you're interested, you can contact me. But we're not here to talk about the megafauna fossils. But we found 20-meter tall or long giant sloths so far. But I want to focus on the water temple that was built during 800, 900 CE. Now we have evidence that the Maya have been visiting here on pilgrimages for hundreds of years, centuries and centuries, but they only intruded during this period of multi-year droughts between 800 and 900 CE. And the plaster floors are really thick, like 10 centimeters. That's a lot of wood. They're very substantial. There was a corbel vaulted temple, and it was so close to the edge of pool 1 that it actually collapsed into it. And I don't know if it was caused by looting. Of course, there's looting everywhere, kind of thing. And there was a hallway that took you to one room. But before they left the area by 900 after their pleadings with the gods did not work. They deanimated it. They took down the roofs, they stacked them in the rooms, and then they covered the building and burned it. They covered it with tufa. Tufa is limestone, but it forms underwater. What happens is like a branch falls in a rock, and the calcium carbonate and the mineral rich water precipitates around, you know, pieces of wood or rocks, and then those decompose or whatever, and you get really cool tufa. You can see the remnants, the shape, you know, these plaster molds, if you will, tufa molds of branches kind of thing. And the thing is, there's plenty of limestone everywhere. I mean, to get to Pool 1, we drive down a ravine, and there's stock, and there's limestone everywhere on the surface everywhere. They could have covered it, they could have deanimated it with surface limestone, but they went into the water to deanimate it with something from the water, you know, which shows that connection, that merging of the worlds, you know. And we also found 75% of the ceramics we found were terminal classic water jars or wide orifice jars. The cool thing is that they're all Kyo slipped, but the thing is that the shapes, the rims, the necks all represent terminal classic jars from the northern lowlands, from the Petén, and from southern Belize. Okay, so from all over the Maya area. I don't know if they're bringing them with them or making them nearby. There's a little teeny settlement near Sweat Bath nearby. And when we tried to put together the vessels, none were complete. So they took pieces away with them as a remembrance to, or they threw them in the water, but nothing is complete here. Nothing, nada, nothing. Okay, and also all of them, they terminated the building, but they also terminated the jars. There are finger-sized breaks, scallops on every single vessel, like thumb-sized breaks. And I argued that that was a means of termination. And water jars, I mean, you know, they're used for cooking, for storage, for water, and all this kind of thing. They're used in ceremonies, and all of them also were large. We didn't find any individual sized anything. Okay, and in the Madrid Codex, you can see Chac and Choctaw pouring water like a storm or rain or whatever from water jars. So this mundane, you know, item serves a purpose. You know, so things always have these multiple purposes. And nearby the water temple, we exposed this long and narrow ceremonial platform, and you can still see all the burning, where we found over 6,000 sherds smashed, vessels smashed on top. Okay, and most were terminal classic, and most were jars, and all incomplete. You know, and we found like a minimal number of non-ceramic artifacts, kind of thing. And we found a teeny step that's only a meter away from the pool. And this was like in 2016 or 2017. So I haven't done any sponsored any diving since then. So now we know where to look for the offerings finally. But that's something down the line kind of thing. So this was for, this probably didn't have walls. It was for some kind of procession and to make the offerings, to make offerings into the water, you know, ceramics, perhaps jade, perhaps humans, I don't know. We did do trenching of this, and we found human remains, and they're not burials, they're not sacrifices. I'm calling them human caches, because if everything's on the same plane, everything thus can be equally a cache. And it looks like they're all bundled. So they could have been ancestors bundled, you know, sometimes post-classic Maya would bundle their ancestors when they moved, when they migrated. This could have been the same case. And we need to explore it more, but I do think they were caches to bring part of home with them, to commune with the ancestors, to merge the ancestors and all this kind of thing. And I also think that it was part of a ceremonial circuit, because traditional Maya, you know, ethnographically, go on ceremonial circuits following the path of the sun. So starting in the east, going to the west. And of course, the gods created the Cara Blanca pools on an east-west line. You know, that wasn't accidental. And so you hear, so here's pool 20 that I showed you at the beginning. And they actually practiced geomancy. They carved steps out of this natural knoll, and they added when they had to create a little pyramid temple. And there's a sweat bath here between pool 1 and pool 2. That's just off the page here. Okay, here's pool 1. And as you know, if you ever work in the Maya area, you don't need a sweat bath. So this was done, I think, for ritual purification. And also you couldn't stay at pool 1. So I think this area in between the two pools was a place to cook, to stay. There were visitors, there's evidence for all these low-lying platforms that people could set up camp, if you will. We've excavated that in 2018, and one of my PhD students, Jean Larman, wrote part of her dissertation on those wet bath excavations. If you're interested, you can find all this on the Valley of Peace Archaeology website, project website. Okay, and there's other evidence for ceremonial architecture, like above pool 6, which are 2 collapsed cenotes. Up here, Andrew found a plazuela group with a plain stele altar, which you typically find in centers. So something was going on here, and I do think it was part of ceremonial circuit. And so it was a means to engage with the gods and ancestors, but also a way to engage with this untouchable area. Okay, the way to engage with the forest spirits and things they don't necessarily see in their own areas, because this area, again, I think was left completely untouched. Mary, I don't have a watch here. How are we on time?
We should probably transition to questions in about 4 minutes.
Okay, will do. Okay, so let me just, thank you very much. So Cara Blanca, several prolonged droughts, we see an intensification of visits, especially since they lost faith in their kings. Cenotes, no houses, no agricultural fields, pilgrimage sites, thus are conservation areas, seed banks, etc. And so now there's an area on top of the cliff that you can overlook the area. So in 2010, there was a massive hurricane. And I know you can't see, but it's really green here. And then it gets increasingly dry. And then during the following subsequent dry season, massive wildfires. And so the sustainable logging company sold it to Spanish Lookout, which is a mechanized Mennonite industrial business, agribusiness. And this is what it looks like today. So I was awarded a 3-year National Science Foundation grant to do rescue salvage archaeology to collect as much information from these, all these white dots are exposed farmsteads, and to just collect as much info as possible. And I was supposed to start in 2020, but with COVID, so 2022, hopefully I'll be able to go there to collect as much info before it's all plowed away. Okay, I'm just going to bypass this. So in our world today, we focus on anthropocentrism, and in our attempts to control and tame nature, it has led to the Anthropocene versus a more cosmocentric and inclusive worldview. People work with nature and result in millennia of sustainable living. So the insights is, I think, pretty straightforward. We cannot privilege humans in our future plans. It's better to have diverse and flexible long-term strategies and promote biodiversity, small-scale technologies, rather than relying on large-scale and path-dependent strategies. And it can't come from top-down mitigation alone. It has to be both bottom-up and top-down, beginning with us and our families, our communities on up. And so we need to work with resources, because the natural world has a plethora of resources: food, medicines, building supplies, tools, game, sacred areas, and so on, including collaborate with forests like at Cara Blanca, nature reserves, parks, or create some more pilgrimage sites. And mimic forest diversity I think this can be done at the industrial scale, and it promotes better soils. And if a blight hits one species, of course you can rely on the other kinds of plants and things. I didn't have time to focus on the cities as green cities, because a lot of the open areas not only were for plazas for ceremonies, but also orchards, urban art, agriculture, gardens. There's probably a lot of flora and fauna and a lot of trees, and they relied on a local resource network without having major transportation networks. So everything was locally sourced. And we can create our own clean water via constructed wetlands. Let's turn swimming pools into constructed wetland biospheres, because you could, catch some fish, plant medicinal plants, and you can still swim and you can drink the water. Organic waste. I mean, without the evidence of toilets in the archaeological record, they likely, as many traditional farming cultures have done, is use human waste and other organic waste as fertilizer in their gardens everywhere. And we have yet to find an ancient Maya cemetery And only scholars have suggested that only 10% of people are buried in house floors or tomb floors or whatever. That 90%, I think they were planted. I know ethnographically there's cases where they bury somebody in the forest and plant a tree over them. That's probably represent 90% of pre-Columbian Maya population. Change our labor technology ratios. I mean, we have a lot of labor. That's green energy. It ain't going to go away anytime soon. Work, use traditional ecological knowledge. Work with local stakeholders, because we have to adapt. Conditions are not going to change, or they will, but not in a good way. So we have to. And diversity is key to manage risk. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the divers, my foreman and field assistants and students, and Miss Louisa and others. And I know I rushed through the end, but I wanted to leave it open for questions.
Thank you so much. All right, so I want to go ahead and you've got some applause coming in.
Oh, thank you.
So I want to make sure we have time for questions. We had one come in earlier, and then those of you guys that do have questions, feel free to add them into chat, and then we'll start going through them as they come up. But your first one came in by Kelly Carmian, who's still thinking about the megafauna fossils and wondering if the Maya knew about them, and was there a reason, was this perhaps a reason why there was an emphasis on pool one, sort of the negotiation, or perhaps the initial foci of negotiation with that pool? Was it tied to the megafauna?
Well, it could have been one of the reasons, but one of the things about pool one is because it's so deep, even when during the long droughts, some of the water levels were dropping because it's tied to sea level and all this kind of thing. So some of the water, so the deeper cenotes would still have water. They might have known. I found a few fragments that look like fossilized bone, but I don't know. And the fossil bed begins about 21 meters below, and that's something that's definitely reachable. And I know, like in caves, they build niches way high up. I remember Cameron Griffith, a cave archaeologist working with Jaime Aui, told me once, he said, when we go to caves like Atun, Chunichu, McNall in the main chamber, it's 3 stories high. And they're like, oh, there's no way they could have gotten up there in the past. And they use their fancy spelunking gear, and lo and behold, there's something up there. So we can't take anything for granted. So they might have known about it, but I think the issue was that it was this water that the level never seemed to drop much, that it was this beautiful blue, that there was a portal within a portal, that it was a portal, that there were many portals along, the east-west, so to me, it was telling them a story, and that to merge their stories with the Cara Blanca, they did it through these rituals kind of thing. So the megafauna, they are, Jeannie Larman is the first author in a Science Advances piece. They did an isotopic analysis with Stan Ambrose on one of the a tooth, and it dated to 27,000 years ago. And back 27,000 years ago, it was more savanna-like. But M. Greg McDonald is the paleontologist, and so far we've only found giant sloths. So he thinks it supports his idea that sloths did indeed travel in herds in the past. I don't know.
Very cool. Very cool. And are there any other questions coming from you guys? Oh, we've got a couple of comments coming in. So I just saw the one from David Carballo. So that one slide mentioned waterborne disease and the importance of having clean water. And he was wondering about related mosquito-borne diseases.
Yes, well, I've done research on that, and mosquitoes are actually found in some of the iconography, especially on some ceramic polychrome vessels. But there are some natural botanical that people would have used for the itching. And I think there's still a controversy about when malaria came to the Americas, like if it was post-European kind of thing. So I'm not sure about that, but I do know they had medicines for everything. The more I read about it, the more, and stomach aches and cancer. I mean, there's botanical, the medicinal potentialities of the forest products is amazing. So, so yeah, I do think they could address waterborne, some of the waterborne diseases. Not all of them, I would assume, but I do think, yeah, again, that traditional ecological knowledge and the fact that they've dealt with them for thousands of years, I do think they would have been able to deal with them for sure.
Yeah, and he was also asking if there's anybody working on the demographic impacts of this in the lowlands versus the highlands. So in terms of thinking about, you know, the distinctions in mosquito-borne illness.
No, that I know of, no. I mean, David, if you know somebody or has a student who might be interested, I have a lot of sources, I mean, you know, references, and it's something, I mean, that would be wonderful if we could find somebody to do that, actually.
I'm sorry, I unmuted myself, but yeah, so I mean, it seems like an interesting topic. I've read something on it in Colombia, but it does seem like you say, most of them came from Afro-Eurasia and arrived with colonialism, and so the malaria, yellow fever, etc. So I feel like it seems like an important variable in differential colonialism in Mesoamerica and the highlands or lowlands.
I'm gonna stop the share. Okay. Well, I mean, if you have some more information, I would love it because, right, I mean, I talk about the iconography and then what the Maya, what botanists have recorded today or ethnohistorically about some of the medicines. There's a lot there.
And then we've got a question from Samantha Nadell asking, do you know the percentage of plants wildlife that Mr. Chalk, I can't remember his first name. Okay. Could identify in the area around the pool that you refer to as a pilgrimage site? I think it was pool 2. And then Sam's asking if this might be connected to the forest collaboration of these sites.
Yes, there's a different assemblage, if you will, of plants near pool 1, the ceremonial one, versus just, you know, the regular transect, if you will. Like there was more allspice trees and cotton trees, you know, with the spikes, and then ceiba. There's just a lot more of those trees that you find in the iconography or in the origin stories and this kind of thing at the pool. So even there, they probably promoted it, but you know, sort of the trees that are more associated with gods and ancestors, that kind of thing. And we found even a few water vines, which, you know, you don't really need there. But to me, it's, you know, the trees connect the underworld, the earth, and the heavens kind of thing. So yes, there's definitely seems to be a preliminary difference of the assemblage at pool 1 that reflects the role it played as a pilgrimage center. Now, we haven't like done a botanical, I mean, if you were to look at all the collections, you could probably see if they start to change as you get closer and closer to the pools, and maybe even look at a boundary of the, you know, the sacred area or something. I do that in quotes because they didn't really have a term for sacred because they didn't separate sacred and non-sacred. So I hope I answered that question.
And then one of the points that I wanted to ask about and sort of broadening it out before we need to leave. I know you're doing work with UNESCO and thinking about sort of applying this to conservation strategies. And I'm sort of wondering how you've been able to pivot the archaeologically acquired data and the information you've gathered through collaboration with Maya peoples to the strategies for forest conservation and devising this like forest collaboration approach and then working with UNESCO to actually implement it. And if there's any lessons that you could sort of share with us about doing that applied approach, building from your archaeological research.
Right. Well, there's a couple things. There's a new director at UNESCO Mexico, so I've had less interaction with them. And the cool thing about that was that once things go through peer review and it's published, they get millions of visits. And so you just hope that you're able to reach people. And I was hoping somebody would reach out, but I have translated this to working with other archaeologists working worldwide, as well as landscape architects. And we have a book coming out on applying principles of the past to current and future urban planning with, again, landscape architects having a voice and translating the archaeological record to actual ways to implement that. And that's coming out through the Netherlands. And it's something that once it comes out, it's going to be online. It's going to be free online access. We do plan to send it to policymakers and this kind of thing. And then recently, a consortium of conservation groups in the US headed by the Nature Conservancy purchased over 300,000 acres in central Belize. Their southern border is Cara Blanca. And the cool thing is that it's being managed by Belizeans in Belize. It's called the Belize Maya Forest Trust. And I am one of the 20 people invited to participate in this conservation plan for the 300,000 acres in terms of not just archaeology, but looking at biodiversity and this kind of thing. So it feels like it took, that is just happening slowly but surely in, these kind of ways. And I'm also working on a book for the general public called Maya Wisdom, Family, and the Survival of Our Planet, which is, much of what I'm talking about here will be in that, but it includes a lot of stories from working with Maya foremen and field assistants for 30 years and how they see the world, kind of thing. And that's something that I need to find an agent, which is so that's how I'm implementing it so far. There might be a few other projects, with COVID really sort of impacted things. So, but I do hit. I just co-authored a piece with Robin Cunningham. It's coming out in the British Journal for the British Academy, and it's an issue devoted to cultural heritage and how, in order to learn from the past, because we can and we give examples, we have to save the past. So it's a combined cultural heritage yet future implications from the past, if that makes sense. So it's a slow process, sort of, 2 steps forward, little steps forward, and hopefully no steps back.
Wonderful. And if there are any last minute questions, I think have time for maybe one more. Otherwise, we can go ahead and say thank you.
Okay. Should I look at the chat, or did you want to, or you were going to?
I've been looking at chat. There have been some chats about toilets. And we're all really thrilled.
Well, I heard there might be one at Palenque, but one toilet isn't enough. But it makes sense. And I remember when the Valley of Peace Village was founded in 1981 by the United Nations and the Belize government for refugees from the Civil War in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So it's an amalgamation of different ethnicities and stories and histories and this kind of thing. But when I first started in this area in 1997, I was introduced to the village people, to various people by a Peace Corps couple. And she was so proud of the fact that she got $80,000 to build outhouses because no one had an outhouse. And because Peace Corps, is not the best about using anthropology. Like, well, why didn't they use outhouses? Perhaps because, and I don't know. I haven't asked the questions myself, but maybe they were using them for defecating and peeing in the gardens and the milpas to add their bit of fertilizer, kind of thing. We just don't know. So they had to do something with waste. So I think it was fertilizer.
I do recall talking with Nicholas Carter and Lauren Santini about an article that they were writing about some evidence that they recovered within a chultun, and thinking that perhaps it was related to fecal matter, but in the pre-classic. So I'm not sure where it ended up in publication. Yes, exactly. Mac, you're on this.
Yeah. It's in submission now.
Okay, cool. Yes.
Yep.
Right. So chultuns
Yeah,
Am I
we have fecal parasites in sealed Chilternese contexts.
Interesting. I guess that, but how many chultuns are there per person kind of thing in this? And the thing is about, like, for example, when I've talked to several civil engineers about the reservoir systems, the first thing they ask is not, anything, oh, what have you found? It's like, how did they deal with human waste? Because of all the porous limestone and it going through, and then also contaminating the water, the groundwater issue. So I would love to, can you email me when it comes out, or please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. So yeah, that could add to the pictures, yeah. And I just will look at the chat really quick. Thanks, Kelly. I see your point about David Webster's idea. Yeah. Okay. Mosquitoes, yeah. Okay, well, I think we're running out of time, but if you have questions, if you want to email me, I'd be happy to respond or send you stuff or whatever. So I've really enjoyed this though.
So did we. Thank you so much, Dr. Lucero. We are so grateful to have had you
pleasure.
come and talk with us. I'm pretty excited about your public book too. That sounds incredible.
It's been so fun to write, challenging but fun.
Oh, as it should be.
Well, thank you all. And I really appreciate it. And hopefully someday I can come to Boston in person.
Oh, we would love it. All right. Round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks again, David,
Good to
for
see ya.
the filth plug.
We did come around.